There is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman. It is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, and right now it is the most important piece of geography on Earth, because through that 21-mile gap flows 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That is 20% of the entire world's oil supply, every single day, through a channel that is currently, as of right now, effectively closed. And if you are wondering why your financial advisor looks nervous, why the Fed just canceled its rate cut plans, why the 10-year Treasury yield just jumped to 4.4%, and why Goldman Sachs analysts are quietly running scenarios involving $200 oil, the answer starts and ends at that 21-mile gap. I'm talking about the Strait of Hormuz. And what is happening to it right now rhymes so loudly with one of the most catastrophic economic events in American history that it should make everyone deeply uncomfortable. Because we have been here before. And last time, it did not go well. Let me take you back to 1973. The context was different. Different war, different players, different decade. But the mechanism was identical. A geopolitical conflict in the Middle East triggered a sudden dramatic reduction in global oil supply. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Inflation, which had been sitting at a manageable 3%, exploded to 11%. The stock market crashed 50%. Unemployment doubled. And the United States economy spent the better part of a decade trying to crawl out of the wreckage. The 1973 oil shock is the event that gave economists the word stagflation, the combination of stagnant growth and raging inflation that central banks are essentially powerless against. Because the tools they use to fight inflation, raising interest rates, slow the economy. But if the economy is already slowing because of an oil shock, raising rates makes it worse, and cutting rates to save the economy makes inflation worse. It's a trap with no clean exit. Stagflation is the nightmare scenario. And on February 28, 2026, the conditions for it just arrived. Here is what happened. U.S. and Israeli forces struck Iran. Iran retaliated. And as part of that retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued warnings prohibiting vessel passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Yet tanker traffic through the strait, which had been running at roughly 20 million barrels per day, fell to a near standstill almost immediately. Within days, Brent crude oil surged past $100 per barrel for the first time in 4 years. It peaked at $126 per barrel. Oil analysts at major banks began publishing reports with scenarios reaching $150, $170, and in the most extreme cases, $200 per barrel. The International Energy Agency, the body that coordinates global energy policy among wealthy nations, called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not since 1973, not since 2008, in history. Now, here is where it gets personal, because oil is not just the stuff you put in your car. Oil is the invisible input behind almost everything in the economy. Plastics come from oil. A fertilizer production runs on natural gas, and 30% of globally traded fertilizer normally passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping and aviation run on oil. Manufacturing runs on oil. The cost of getting anything from anywhere to anywhere runs on oil. When oil prices spike 45% in a few weeks, as they just have, every single one of those costs goes up simultaneously, and eventually, not immediately, but inevitably, those costs show up at the supermarket, the petrol station, and on your electricity bill. The UN is already estimating that regional inflation could rise to 4.6% in 2026, up from 3.5% last year. Fertilizer prices are up 35%. LNG, the natural gas that heats European homes, is up nearly 60% since late February. And this is before the full effects have had time to filter through the supply chain. But here is the part that nobody in the financial media is connecting clearly enough. And I want to slow down here because this is the most important mechanism in the entire story. The Federal Reserve spent 2025 cutting interest rates, 3 consecutive cuts. The plan was simple: bring rates down, ease financial conditions, let the economy breathe. And markets loved it. Stocks were near all-time highs. The soft landing narrative was alive. Jerome Powell was, for the first time in years, not the most hated man in finance. and then the Strait of Hormuz closed. Because here is the trap. If oil stays elevated, and the IEA is saying that without a rapid reopening of the strait, supply losses will get significantly worse, inflation makes a comeback. A real one. Not the 2021 pandemic kind that faded. The structural kind. The kind driven by an actual physical shortage of a commodity the entire global economy runs on. And the moment inflation makes a comeback, the Fed cannot cut rates. In fact, the 10-year Treasury yield has already risen 0.5 percentage point since the conflict started to 4.4%, because the bond market is already pricing in the possibility that rate cuts are done, potentially for a long time. Now, remember what we covered when we talked about index funds. Higher long-term yields mean lower stock valuations. They mean higher mortgage rates. They mean tighter credit conditions. All of the things the Fed was trying to undo with its rate-cutting cycle, potentially reversed, not by Jerome Powell, but by a 21-mile stretch of water in the Persian Gulf. This is what the 1973 shock did. It didn't just raise gas prices. Oh, it broke the entire macroeconomic plan that policymakers had spent years building, and it forced a decade of painful recalibration. The question now is whether 2026 rhymes with 1973, or whether it rhymes with something shorter and more contained. And that answer depends almost entirely on one thing. How long does the strait stay closed? Oil executives and analysts have been saying publicly that the strait needs to reopen by mid-April, or the economic damage escalates sharply. Every additional week of disruption fills up storage, forces production cuts, and removes the safety buffers that have been cushioning the shock. The U.S. released 400 million barrels from strategic reserves, the largest emergency release on record, to buy time. But strategic reserves are a buffer, not a solution. They buy weeks, not months. If the strait reopens in the next few weeks, oil prices fall back, inflation expectations stabilize, the Fed gets back on track, and this becomes a dramatic but ultimately contained episode. Markets recover, life goes on. If it doesn't, if the closure extends into the summer, the calculus changes completely. Goldman Sachs has scenarios running at $150 oil through the second quarter. At that level, inflation across Asia spikes sharply. Europe, which is already running on 30% gas storage capacity after a harsh winter, faces potential shortages. Germany and Italy, Europe's industrial backbone, are at serious risk of technical recession. And the Fed sits in the middle of it all, unable to cut because inflation is rising, unable to raise because growth is slowing. Stagflation. Again. And here is something that should make American investors specifically sit up and pay attention. Because the U.S. imports relatively little oil through the Strait of Hormuz, America is the world's largest oil producer. In isolation, the U.S. is partially insulated, but the stock market is not isolated. 80% of the oil that passes through Hormuz goes to Asian markets: China, Japan, South Korea, India. These are not peripheral economies. China is the world's second largest economy. Japan is the third. When their growth slows, when their industrial output falls, when their consumer demand drops, the global companies that make up the S&P 500 feel it. Apple sells phones in China. Amazon runs logistics across Asia. Nvidia sells chips everywhere. There is no such thing as a domestic-only outcome when the disruption is this large. Global stocks have already fallen 5.5% since the conflict started. The S&P is down 6%. The Nasdaq is down 2.4%. Now, what do you do with all of this information? A few things worth considering. And I want to be clear, none of this is financial advice. This is just framework. First, understand that the scenario that markets are currently pricing, a relatively short conflict, a reopening of the strait, oil prices falling back, is the optimistic scenario. It might be correct, but it is worth knowing that you are sitting in an optimistic scenario, not a neutral one. Second, oil at $100 plus for an extended period changes the inflation math in ways that flow directly into your mortgage rate, your credit card rate, and the rate your savings earn. These are not abstract numbers. They are real costs that compound over months and years. Third, and this is the historical lesson from 1973 that gets ignored every single time, The initial shock is never the most damaging part. It's the secondary effects. The supply chain disruptions that take 6 to 12 months to fully materialize. The food price increases that come from fertilizer shortages, the industrial slowdowns that come from expensive energy. These are the things that were still showing up in 1975 and 1976 from a shock that started in 1973. The damage runs longer than people expect, which brings me back to where we started. A 21-mile strip of water, 20 million barrels a day, the largest supply disruption in oil market history, and a global economy that spent 2025 celebrating a soft landing, now staring at the exact conditions that ended the last great period of optimism in 1973. History doesn't repeat. But, as someone once said, it does rhyme. And right now, the rhyme is uncomfortably close. So, where do you land? Do you think, A, the strait reopens quickly and this is a scary but contained episode that markets shrug off within a few months? B, this is the beginning of a real stagflation cycle that breaks the soft landing narrative for years? Or C, the US is insulated enough that this is mainly an Asian and European problem and American investors are overthinking it? Drop your answer in the comments, because this one is moving fast and I want to know where everyone's head is at.